The people of Israel had gone through a lot of junk in their brief existence. They'd faced slavery in Egypt. They'd faced disunity after they came into Canaan before they had kingship. And when they had kings, they faced constant war. And then they divided again, and they faced captivity, both in the south and in the north. They turned to God in times of trouble and turned away from God in times of security, much like we all do. They've gone through this constant cycle of sin and forgiveness so many times, it felt rote. It felt like, okay, we'll let things get bad for a while, and then eventually things will get so bad that we will decide, okay, it's time to call upon the name of God, and God will come in and set everything right at the last minute, and everything will be fine again until we start the cycle all over. But this time felt different. Sure, they turned away from God once again, but this time it felt like they'd gone too far. Adversity was coming fast and thick. The country was already in ruin. The prophets had stopped calling people to repent. They had decided that their message of repentance was no longer useful. It wasn't going to change anything. And so the prophets took this turn and began just telling people, it's going to get worse. Things are going to happen that you're not going to enjoy. The day of God is coming where God will be shown in all of God's righteousness, and you are not going to like it when that day comes. It only gets worse from here. And then came the prophet Joel. And his message confirmed everything that everyone else had been saying. The nation has already been destroyed. There's nothing that can be done to fix this. The fields are already barren. The great and terrible day of the Lord is drawing near.
The Lord thunders at the head of his army. His forces are beyond number, and mighty is the army that obeys his command. The day of the Lord is great. It is dreadful. Who can endure it?
The messages of doom and gloom feel a little out of place in December. With everything and everyone we see encouraging us to be cheerful and filled with the holiday spirit, it feels almost incongruous to talk about things that are frightening, to talk about bad stuff. But it wasn't actually always that way. The Advent season was once thought to be a time when ghost stories should be told, when you should be frightened, because being frightened in this dark season makes sense. It found its way into one of the songs that we sing, not in church, but we hear on the radio on a regular basis from Andy Williams. It's the most wonderful time of the year. One of the things that he says comes during this time are scary ghost stories. Scary ghost stories were a thing that people told. In fact, one of those stories is so well known that we continue to tell it year after year. You probably know the one. It's called A Christmas Carol. For those that do not know the story of A Christmas Carol, it's about a man named Ebenezer Scrooge, played by Michael Caine in the Muppets version, which is the authoritative version and you should all watch. And Scrooge is not very nice. Despite having the name Ebenezer, which means hither have I come by the help of God, he seems to rely exclusively on himself, not on God and not on anyone else, and he doesn't care about anyone else. He cares so little about everyone that he won't even allow his workers a day off on Christmas in Victorian England, where everyone is a good Christian and ought to take Christmas off. And on Christmas Eve, Scrooge is visited by three spirits. We've heard about these spirits. The first one, the ghost of Christmas past, comes to him and shows him all of the mistakes that he has made leading up to the present. Mistakes where he refused to reconcile with his family at Christmas time. Mistakes where he refused to take time off at Christmas time. Mistakes where his love of money, his greed, his desire for more and more cost him the opportunity to marry the woman who he loved and who loved him in return, because he always wanted just a little bit more money before he could finally marry her. And one Christmas, she too left him. Feeling a bit despairing, he moves on to the ghost of Christmas present, who shows him what people are talking about even now as he's dreaming. And those who are talking about him do not have kind words to say. His employees' spouses curse his name at a time when you're supposed to bless everyone, even those whom you're not particularly fond of. His relatives turn him into a party game where he is compared to a monster that is not quite human. Nobody likes Scrooge because Scrooge never seemed to like anybody. And then he is taken to the most fearful scene of all with the ghost of Christmas future, who shows him a graveyard. A graveyard where years hence he will have died on Christmas Day and be buried, with no one to mourn him, with no one to care for his legacy. In fact, the only people talking about him besides the gravedigger who has to put him in the grave are the people who are debating how to divide up his stuff. It seems fitting that all he cared about in life was his stuff, and so all that people cared about in regard to him in his death was what they were going to do with all of the wealth that he had accumulated. As he stares at the ghost of Christmas past, Scrooge begs for just one thing. "Speak comfort to me, spirit," he begs. But the spirit remains silent.
Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity.
As you probably know, Scrooge wakes up in his own bed. He's returned to the present. And he realizes that it's not too late to change. And so change he does. He replaces his miserly lifestyle with a life of generosity. He rewrites his horrible ending, turning it into a tale of happily ever after. And not just for himself. His actions ripple out through the entire community where he lives, and the lives of his family, his employees, and his employees' families are changed for the better, even to the point that it appears lives have been saved. By rending his heart and turning from wickedness, Scrooge ushers in a new era in his own community.
And afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days.
You ever had a Scrooge period in your life? I know I have. When I started college, I was a math major, and I switched very quickly to become a major in psychology. And I was going to become a psychiatrist. Now, Shay, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound particularly Scrooge-ly. You were going to help people, and you're helping people now. This seems reasonable. No. Because my plan was not exactly to help people. My plan was I was going to become a psychiatrist, and I was going to hang my shingle in a wealthy neighborhood, And I was going to listen to rich people complain about their non-problems and charge them premium rates for about 20 years, and then having accrued a large amount of wealth based on all of these people giving me their money to complain about how they think their dog might not like them. I was going to retire and be done with humanity. I didn't really like people all that much, and I didn't really believe that most of these people that were seeking this particular form of help actually needed it, but I did see a way to make money off of it, and that was my plan. That is until I started hearing from everyone around me about this calling that they saw on my life that seemed ridiculous. Have you ever thought about being a preacher? No. No, I have not. Thank you. See you later. Next person. Hey, you know, I really feel like you would make a good pastor. Okay, but I hate people, so that's not really an option. I feel like there are people involved in the whole pastor thing. And one by one, people came to me and told me that they sensed this calling on my life, and I said, no, nonsense. I'm going to make money, I'm going to leave, I'm going to live in a cabin in the woods, no one's going to bother me, it's going to be great. Just leave me alone. But they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and I was having a conversation with my then girlfriend, who would eventually become my fiance and is now my wife. I said, all these people are saying this thing about me, and it's silly, isn't it? How that's nonsense. And she said, well, I kind of always figured you were going to do that. Et tu, Jossie? Et tu? So I called my mother, because of course I knew that my mom knew that there was no way I could ever possibly be a pastor. And she would tell me, continue on with your plan, because my mother saw me as a child and as a teenager and as a young adult, and she knew I was a jerk and just generally not the kind of person that ought to be up here talking to people. And she said, hold on, let me get your dad. My dad gets on the phone with me and says, you know, when you were about 8, this guy came to church and told me and your mother that he thought that your future was to be the next Bill Hybels. You don't all probably know who Bill Hybels is, but he was the cool megachurch pastor at the time that everyone had heard of. The idea being that I was going to preach, and I was going to reach lives, and I was going to be a leader of a faith community. And I said, crap. But it's too late. I'm already a sophomore in college. You can't change your life plan when you're a sophomore in college. I know this sounds ridiculous to most of you sitting out there, but I was convinced that this was not an option. I had already sunk almost half of my degree into doing this other thing, and I had accumulated loans because I was going to be able to pay them off with all the money I was going to be making, and it was going to be fine. And you don't get to change your life plan. I have been told my whole life, you've got to find a major, you've got to stick with it, this is what you're going to do, and all of a sudden everyone from all corners of my life is saying, it's time to change. And I felt like it was too late. I felt like I had missed this calling on my life. I finally acknowledged, okay, yes, fine, maybe I'm called to be a pastor, but too late, I can't do it. That's not a thing I can do, so I'm gonna continue with the thing, and then, sorry, we'll have to pass the calling off. Until one night, when I was driving in my car, and for whatever weird reason, no radio station would work for me. And for the kids in the audience, this was before things like Bluetooth, and I did not have a CD in the car with me, until I found one station with one old-timey preacher that was talking about Jacob wrestling with God, and talking about how if you're wrestling with God, it's time to learn to let go and start to lean on God. And I pulled my car over, and I burst into tears, and I lost it for a good hour. And then I drove home, and I started sending applications to colleges saying it's time for me to accept this thing. here. Your story is your own. And perhaps you're right where you need to be. Or perhaps you are in the midst of a period such as mine and such as Scrooge's, where you're not at all where you need to be. Maybe you've already turned away from selfish desire and committed yourself fully to God. But if you haven't, what better time than a season that's supposed to be all about generosity, togetherness, and love? You know what? Maybe that Joel story is a little Christmassy.